Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Coffee.
Taste every flavor. Bold coffee by experts for experts.
It's the world's most popular drink, but it's not getting any cheaper. Coffee buyers are paying record prices for the crop.
Coffee prices and Robusta, highest since the 1970s.
We are going to still consuming a cup of coffee every morning, almost no matter what the price is.
In Uganda, farmers received a record 7,000 shillings per kilo of Robusta beans. That's around $1.89. But it's not all good news. This windfall comes at a time of a cost of living crisis and has made the farms an obvious target for criminals.
They're using dogs to guard plantations. They're using bees. This is to stop thieves from snatching those unharvested beans straight from the trees under the cover of darkness.
On today's Next Africa podcast, we'll look at the impact the rising cost of coffee is having and whether this unprecedented crime wave is actually here to stay. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. So joining us on the podcast this week is Mumbi Gitau. She is a soft commodities reporter covering all things commodities globally. Mumbi, how are you? Thanks for joining us.
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a busy year for you, I think, to say the least. We were just talking about how it started off with cocoa for you. Now it's coffee. Maybe paint the picture for us right now about what exactly is going on and what we should focus on when it comes to coffee right now.
It's been an interesting market for me. As you said, we started off with the cocoa rally, and then swiftly we've moved on to the coffee market. And it's important to know that these are all the luxurious things that every one of us likes to have every once in a while. The coffee market has seen significant weather challenges, particularly in Vietnam. So we have two types of coffee. We have the Robusta and we also have the Arabica beans. The Arabica beans are what we consider the premium, smooth flavored beans that are favored by the likes of Starbucks or probably your favorite coffee chain. And then we have the likes of Robusta beans, which is considered cheaper and considered a little more acidic but has a higher caffeine content. Now, the shock that we've seen in supply is in Robusta beans. Vietnam is the largest producer of these beans, and earlier this year they had bad weather, so we've seen production in that country go down. This year we started with Robusta beans at about $2,700, and right now we are looking at $5,300. So that has been about an 80% increase in Robusta beans. That has made coffee very expensive, especially the instant type or your blends that are used in espressos. So that's why you're seeing probably the cost of your coffee go up this year.
And Mumbi, not to put you on the spot, but I do remember when we talked about cocoa, you didn't necessarily consume cocoa too much. When it comes to coffee, I mean, is this a Mumbi favorite or are you just very interested in covering it?
I hate to say, but I'm more of a tea drinker. I'm trying to get into coffee just so that I know how to taste and identify good coffee. But I like my tea, but I'm now starting to get into coffee, but I'm not those coffee snobs that won't take a particular type of coffee.
And I think all of us know coffee is very precious to people, right? And the taste and where it comes from. And so maybe you touched a bit there on some of the biggest growers globally. Maybe you can tell us more about that. Where are these beans coming from that people are willing to spend a lot of money to get their cup of coffee?
Initially, as I mentioned, Vietnam is our biggest producer of Robusta beans, but globally, Brazil is the biggest producer of both Arabica and Robusta beans. So cumulatively, it's the biggest exporter and producer of coffee beans. But we also have the likes of Ethiopia, Uganda, Indonesia, India, Colombia, Honduras, which are also very important to the supply of coffee in the world. But most times we pay a lot of attention to what is happening in Brazil and what is happening in Vietnam.
And so then what was the catalyst to where we are now, to where we're seeing prices, futures prices at levels we haven't seen in quite a while? And that's with both of these beans.
Yes. So initially it started with Robusta. That's where we saw the first shock. It was not widely anticipated that we would have lower production in Vietnam, but they had bad weather, they had drought, and then that obviously led to a decline in production, and that's kept the market quite heated. And even this year, we are expecting the country to get even less production because they had drought earlier in the year. Now, the world is now paying so much more attention to Brazil, where there's also dry weather and the trees there are meant to be flowering, but the rain is not coming down yet. So anything that is weather related causes the market to be on the edge, and the market is very sensitive to dry weather, to frost, to lots of rain. So that's why we are seeing the market rally to 13-year highs for Arabica and Robusta, to records that we've not seen since the 1970s.
Wow. And I wonder, as somebody who's covering this closely, what's been your perspective in watching these prices continually tick up? Was it inevitable, just given a lot of the weather-related events that we've been seeing?
Some of it was inevitable because it's hard to predict the weather. I think that's one of the things that's very hard to predict in this life. So one week we are looking at a frost, the other week we are looking at heat waves, the other week we are looking at possible typhoons or drought in one region. The weather has been oscillating between two extremes, and that's always very hard to predict how a crop will behave. If it's in Ivory Coast and Ghana, where we have cocoa, too much rain is bad, but very hot weather is also bad. So plants require such a delicate balance of just optimum weather. And if that is not available, then we have the supply shocks that we are seeing currently.
And Mumbi, before we go to the break, maybe you can explain how you're mentioning how this affects producers. How does this then trickle down to the consumer? Is it that a lot of these buyers are just increasing their prices because the supply is just so limited?
Yes, it starts with the farmers. So when farmers realize that there's competition for their beans, they start to raise their prices. And even among traders, they also start to compete among each other. So it's the highest bidder that gets the beans. That helps to fuel prices higher and higher every day. And I think that's good for the farmer, especially in an era where they've not been getting as much money for their beans. But for the consumer, that just means spending more dollars and more pounds for your cup of coffee. In the long run, I think the issue has been to ensure that farmers are fairly remunerated for the amount of work that they put in the fields. Tending to a coffee plantation is not easy. Picking the cherries, taking them to the washing station. So farmers have always been saying we need a fair price, and maybe this rally in prices helps them get part of that fair price.
Stick with us, Mumbi. After the break, we'll talk more about how these rising prices are affecting farmers and growers on the ground in Africa. We'll be right back. And welcome back. We still have Mumbi Gitau, Bloomberg soft commodities reporter, joining us to talk all things coffee and coffee crops. So, Mumbi, we were talking a little bit about the global producers before the break, but you mentioned some of the African producers, and in particular, how what we're seeing right now is affecting them. Can you dig more into that and where we're seeing this really have an impact on coffee farmers?
So when we saw earlier in the year that Vietnam was not giving as much supply as the world needed, a lot of attention started also to shift to Uganda, which is also coming up as a powerhouse in terms of coffee production. Its coffee production has gone up increasingly higher every single year. And so it was very helpful for it to come and plug the shortfall. But that did not mean that prices were going to fall that much lower. So we saw farmers in Uganda and exporters in Uganda shipping a lot more coffee to Europe, to the Middle East, to the Americas. And that way they helped to ensure that the shortfall we saw from Vietnam was being fulfilled.
And in Uganda, there's an interesting picture that's being painted there. We actually talked to our reporter, Fred Ojambo, who is based in Kampala. And he told us in particular what the farmers there are having to resort to just as the prices continue to tick up.
Farmers say that their farms are targeted because of the high prices, and they resorted to guarding their farms to avoid being victims to the thefts of cherries from their farms. Some of the methods they are using, employing dogs, others into apiary, although this one is meant to enhance pollination of the crop, but they argue that it could scare away thieves who use the cover darkness to rob their crop. So they say they may fear to antagonize the bees it is a concern. It takes a lot of money to hire guards to guard, but some of them have resorted to waking up occasionally during the night, scout around their farms, which are at their backyards.
I think from my days when I was in Kenya, I used to see how excited coffee and tea farmers used to be when they get their pay. And I imagine that's the same case for Uganda farmers. They are seeing prices that they've probably not seen in their lifetime. They're getting a lot more money for their coffee, and that's incentivizing crime. So if you see that your neighbor is earning a lot more from coffee and you probably do not own a coffee plantation, then you might be incentivized to walk in there in the middle of the night, pluck a few cherries, go dry them, and then sell them to the highest bidder.
And we know that coffee beans, Mumbi, are not the only crop that's been targeted for food crime, especially globally. I mean, is there anything that we know, just based on your own reporting, that people are doing to prevent this from happening?
You're right. So earlier in the year, we also covered about thefts of cocoa in the West Africa region. At the time, prices had also rallied to $11,000 a ton, and that also incentivized the kind of theft that you're seeing in Uganda. I have seen most government ask communities to form patrols to try and ensure security in their areas. There's very little that a government can do apart from try and increase policing activities and patrols in the area, because remember, some of these farms are not fenced, so they're very open, so they're open to any trespassers to come in and out. But I think community patrols and the government giving them access to more police patrols, that might be helpful for them.
And in Uganda, we're also seeing bees even getting into the mix to helping thwart thieves. What does all of this mean then? Is this windfall here to say for some of these African countries? And especially, you mentioned that Uganda is trying to be a powerhouse. Is it possible, considering the situation they're dealt with?
I think as long as we are still facing weather-related challenges, farmers may continue to earn a lot more. It's hard for these prices to come off the highs that they're at without a significant supply rebound. Now, we've been going from 1 year of bad weather to another year of bad weather. So we've had consecutive years of bad weather, so much that we are not replenishing the stocks that we are slowly tapping into. So for the foreseeable future, prices could stay high. Will the rally continue? I think that's all dependent on the weather, whether it's favorable or not. But at least for now, prices are likely to stay high.
And Mumbi, just finally, what's the next commodity to watch for? Just considering, I mean, weather is affecting so many different crops. I mean, I wonder what you've got your eye on next.
My eyes are actually on sugar, because Brazil is also the biggest producer of sugar. And we've seen fires in the region, dry weather in the region, and that's impacting sugar production. Just yesterday, we saw prices go back to levels that we last saw in April. So raw sugar is an important one for us to watch. Now, Africa is not the biggest producer of raw sugar. Actually, it's a net importer. So if prices of raw sugar surge in other parts of the world, then Africa will probably have a higher import bill when it comes to importing sugar, and they'll have more expensive sugar going forward.
Just at a time when they're hoping inflation to ease. Mumbi Gitau, Bloomberg's Soft Commodities reporter. Mumbi, always great to get you on. Thank you so much for your reporting.
Thank you.
And you can read all the latest on the price of coffee across Bloomberg News platforms now. We'll also put a link to Fred's reporting in the show notes. Now, here's a few other stories in the region that we're watching. Historic rainfall bucketed down in Central Europe, Africa, Shanghai, and the U.S. Carolinas this week. At least 1,000 people have died in Africa, and millions of people have been displaced. Also, the South African Reserve Bank joined the Federal Reserve and other central banks globally cutting interest rates for the first time in years as inflation eases across their economies. And you can follow these stories across Bloomberg, including the next Africa newsletter. We'll also put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcasts. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks for listening.